Okay, welcome back. It is late October 1871. We left off then with a bit of a kind of bumper episode back in May, which saw the conclusion, really, of actions against Egypt. Our operations, for the most part, wrapped up. We controlled the kind of political heartland of Egypt and had forced their conventional forces to the south of the country, and we were fairly happy to sit on Cairo, sit on Suez and Alexandria, let the war score stock up, and then dictate terms. It seemed like a fairly cut and dry argument at the time. You can see, looking at the map at Egypt just now, that it's clear that that is not what has unfolded throughout the summer. What we're looking at is a pretty robust insurgency. You can see even that we've occasionally conducted kind of operations to the south of where we were positioned, really with a view only of destroying Egyptian forces, and then falling back to ensure that we have forces holding Cairo and holding the interior. Dumyat has fallen to rebels. The town itself, the surrounding district, is for the most part under our military control, but they control that town to the rear. You can see that they've got scouting forces. I mean, they've got forces all over the place. It's a really lively insurgency. Now, insurgencies are such that it doesn't mean that, our military forces are so overwhelmingly powerful that are in the region that there's no prospect of us losing Egypt or anything like this, but it's just that it erodes our prestige because they occasionally recapture areas only to be thrown back out. It's a kind of running saw. You can see also that some insurgent forces have recaptured Saloum, breaking off our link to Libya. This year we found ourselves kind of buried in a whole lot of Egyptian arse, and there's a question of what's the end game here? And this has been compounded by another factor, and that is, now I did not see any kind of scripted event pertaining to this. I don't think that I missed it, because scripted events are always here. I always carefully read this section. I really fairly carefully read all reports, to tell you the truth, but especially with regards to scripted events, because this is where big geopolitical changes happen, like the unification of a country or something like that, a big historical event, and sometimes there will be events that are important that pertain to us, and I've not seen anything, but Abdelaziz's statistics are virtually zeroed out. Military statistics are still pretty high, but administration and diplomacy, both of which were, I think administration was quite high. They've just basically, they're the lowest they can be, pretty much. I think they're both at 1. That has an impact on two things. One, of course, it affects our administration, our tax revenue, and things like this, and the amount of revenue our capitalist economy generates. Luckily, our economy is of a magnitude now that we can weather that storm. It's not too much of an issue. But where it does cause problems is this zeroes out our income of diplomats. What this really means is that we don't have... I don't know how long this is going to last. This political crisis might be the beginning of the end game for Abdelaziz. I know that in the early 1870s, I don't know a huge amount about the details of his toppling, to tell you the truth. And a part of that, anyway, is because I think there's quite a lot of ambiguity around his kind of losing power. I know it happens mid-70s, I think it's 75, 76. But he was in some trouble beforehand. There was a culminating political crisis, which I kind of addressed before. Some of that is the fact that he kind of hedged these bets on the international stage and held up Louis Napoleon III in France as a kind of really good concrete example of an absolutist monarch that has a kind of constitutional window dressing and is seen as progressive and things like this. And a lot of this was, the zeitgeist of the 1860s was kind of reformism, especially in the aftermath of the 1848 revolution. And Abdelaziz came from this kind of tradition of monarchs as well, looking at reforms, modernizing the empire, replicating Western characteristics, institutional traditions, and things like this. The 1870s, there's now kind of blowback against that. Okay, Germany hasn't united yet. Instantly, the Franco-Prussian War has kicked off, and the Germans or the Prussians have been sitting outside Paris. I don't know whether or not this is kind of sort of mission critical in terms of the unification of Germany, but of course Bismarck is the minister-president in Prussia. He's a kind of leading conservative figure, and increasingly people are looking to him in the Ottoman Empire as an example, of a powerful, successful, kind of dynamic Western figure, which the Ottoman Empire should emulate. And this is a much more comfortable example for Ottoman kind of pashas as well, because of course the collapse of Louis Napoleon III results in a republic, and no one on the Ottoman Empire, really, for the most part, among the ruling elite, absolutely is interested in the idea of a republic. the French model is kind of gone, and this is expressing itself, I guess, in the gradual isolation of Abdelaziz. You know, he doesn't really have the kind of international clout that he did. The result of this, concretely, is isolationism. Even before the toppling of Abdelaziz, the Ottoman Empire can no longer make any kind of plays on the international stage. This is fairly realistic. I think this is quite good. I didn't really anticipate it. I didn't really realise there was going to be a kind of gradual process of his isolation. I quite like that, and there's nothing we can do to control that, you know. I mean, I quite like, for example, in Paradox games, you tend to have this quite sort of dialectical system with regard to things like diplomacy, stability. All these kind of things are sort of interrelated, which is to say that if your stability is hit and it suffers, you know, from that you have less kind of income in terms of your political capital, and therefore you're deprived of the means with which to address things like stability. It's a really, really good system. I really like it. But in kind of AGO games, especially in Pride of Nations, we are kind of, we're part sort of actor, part, rider of the correct crest of history. We're not playing the monarch, we're playing the kind of administration, the civil service. We're the wire pullers, the people behind the scenes, and we've done what we can, and we've played a really good game. I mean, if you look at the map of the Ottoman Empire, it looks decidedly 18th century and not 19th century. But in terms of the fortunes of our monarch, there's not much we can do about this. This means that I don't know how long this could last. I mean, if this goes on all the way through, I think it's Mehmed V is in power for a couple of months. I might be wrong on the name of the monarch, or I think it's Mehmed V, and then it goes on to Abdul Hamid, and Abdul Hamid reigns for 30 years, and rules actually. He's the last absolutist monarch. And he's not really, I mean, where he is capable is he must have been a really effective intriguer and a plotter, but it is a period of profound decline for the Ottoman Empire, so that's likely to express itself in terms of Abdul Hamid's stats, and he's very isolationist as well. One of the anxieties is that kind of the amount of dealings that the Ottomans had with the British and the French has served to embolden liberals internally and this kind of thing. So anyway, it might mean that we have no more sort of kind of diplomatic power that we can use to make any more plays on the international stage, possibly for the next 30 or 40 years. That's a real possibility. That means that all of our kind of colonial plays in East Africa are basically in a kind of stasis. At the moment, they're in a stasis. We can still make plays in Somalia to keep the Italians out, or to have enough kind of colonial penetration to stop them making any kind of play. We can't lay a stake on anything. It's laying a stake. So, for example, if Italy did try and make a play for Somalia, laying a stake requires diplomatic power, which we don't have. We've got plenty of state revenue. We've got plenty of lots of other stuff. We've got a lot of the whistles and bells of a modern, industrial state, but we don't have kind of political power. The other thing, of course, is Tunisia. So we are continuing to make plays, things like merchants. We already have a merchant station, really just to try and force our colonial penetration up, and in doing that, forcing the colonial penetration of other powers to kind of atrophy. So we could try and make plays to kind of maintain certain areas as no man's land, like Tunisia, like Somalia. But in terms of, for example, Eritrea as a protectorate, bringing Eritrea into formal colonial status is not on the cards until we have, an income of diplomats. The income of diplomats issue also pertains to another thing. One, it's Egypt. We are no longer in a position to dictate terms to Egypt. We have to sit back and wait for them to offer us peace deals, and they're just offering us chicken feed, Ghazala, Salkim and Siwa. This is stuff that we've been offered before. We want Suez, really. I think Suez is important for us, and they're not offering it. Now, we could just sit back. My thinking is it's 71. We're going to sit back until spring, summer next year, and wait for the kind of Egyptian offers to roll in. The Egyptians, for whatever reason, do have they can make diplomatic plays, obviously, because they're continuously offering us stuff. They're 4, so the Khedive Pasha's 8, 4, so he's got an income of diplomats, basically. Most minor powers don't. For example, Greece and Moldavia, I don't think they do. The only reason they say that is because they've not offered us anything. They've not offered us anything at all, so I don't think... And this then raises the question, what do we do? 5, they should do. They should theoretically have an income of diplomats, but maybe they don't because they're just really minor powers. I know from playing a multiplayer game where I was Greece, it was a big multiplayer game. I didn't have an income of diplomats, I don't think, even though I theoretically had the kind of stats that I should. But minor powers are not designed to be played, really. So, yeah. It means that our occupation of Greece and Romania either just continues as a military occupation, or we withdraw. But if we withdraw, we're still at war with them. And then they'll just eventually begin to conduct raids. So our only option is to maintain a military occupation of these two regions, and to maintain a military occupation of Egypt until Egypt offers us something that we can live with. And all of this combined is, of course, depressing our relations with other powers, crucially with Britain and France. Britain is now -6. And we still have kind of like commerce agreements with both Britain and France, but at some point that might be untenable. They might take the view that they don't want a commerce agreement with us. They end a commerce agreement with us. That hits our economy hard, because it means that, you know, that we get preferential treatment for two of the biggest kind of export markets in Europe, export markets for us, and that's the domestic market for Britain and France. And of course, they have commerce agreements with other powers. But it has been important for our economy. We would still survive as a powerful economy. Our economy would weather it, but a bit pressure on private capital income. Private capital income at the moment is so great that we don't really have anything to spend the money on, not without creating crazy distortions in the economy, you know. So we're at a point now where we're just accumulating private capital. We can't reinvest, and eventually that's going to trigger an economic crisis. We've kind of reached like a crisis of overproduction. The other thing is that Abdelaziz's administration ratings tanking has also had a consequence on the number of available structures that we can access. So now, all of a sudden, we can't build anchorages. There's certain things, the ceiling for what we can build has kind of gone down. These are things I didn't anticipate, but they're interesting. It's meant that the 1870s, you know, trouble in paradise, we've gone from a, you know, really good start in the game to now kind of to trouble, you know, like yeah, real trouble. There's limits in terms of what we can build. We're caught in a kind of multiple conflicts that require us to deploy substantial troops. Bear in mind that, you know, I mean, the war in Greece also massively increases the revolt risk of ethnic Greeks in northern Greece. So we're now locked into a situation where we have to maintain significant military presence in these regions just to hold them down. So in the event now of a large conflict with, say, Austria or Russia or anyone else, yeah, this has ramifications. It means that we have less forces at our disposal. One thing that can flow from this is that we might have to look at an army reform program, and I'm thinking of a fairly significant army expansion. I say significant, probably in addition of a 3 army corps. One will be a guard corps, 2 regular line corps, a couple of cavalry divisions, independent artillery, and all this kind of thing. And we do have enough 3 stars. The thing that we lack is 2 stars as junior officers. So we've got 3 stars that we can use for such a force. And we've also got a couple of 2 stars. But yeah, so we do have, you know, we have the kind of 3-star generals. How long for, I don't know. But we could be looking at an army expansion to create, I think it'll be a 7th or an 8th army. We might have to do that, given that we'd be looking at possibly long-term deployments in Egypt. Now, we could take a chicken feed Egyptian offer, and that might be on the cards. We might have to do that. But I'm going to hold position for the time being. Could continue to conduct operations against Egyptian insurgents and see what the situation looks like, you know, kind of come, I guess, yeah, come spring and summer 72. Now, I mean, Egypt looks a lot like Aden. The difference between Egypt and Aden, well, there's 2 differences. One, in Egypt, we can deploy significantly larger forces because we've got a large port in Alexandria, and we've just got the, you know, greater means now to supply forces. So we can deploy European-sized forces in Egypt. So the means that we have to combat this insurgency are much greater. We can deploy the kind of firepower in Egypt, which means that this insurgency is never going to achieve the kind of feats that the Yemeni insurgency did in the 50s and early 60s. The downside is we don't have the colonial mechanism to ultimately kind of like extinguish this insurgency. This insurgency is probably going to be permanent until we secure a peace deal with Egypt. And then when we do, we're going to be likely looking at insurgency in the areas that we control. This is why Egypt is always a little bit of a, like, you know, it looks better than it is. And it's also why this game captures really well the kind of peril of these kind of adventures, this sort of adventurism, you know. Yeah, but at the same time, we entered the new decade flush, you know, with kind of economic growth, successful military campaigns against, you know, a modern European power in the form of Austria, and I was kind of thinking, well, what's going to hold us back? If Austria could defeat us with 1 million men, with a massive army, who is going to be able to defeat us, And it's now landed us in a spot of bother because we've got, we're now spread a little bit thin, holding down minor powers, and I don't know, sort of batting flies away with, batting a hornet's nest with in Egypt. It's I don't know. We're going to sit tight in Egypt. We're going to continue to prosecute localized campaigns. Once the north is secure, we'll conduct limited campaigns to the south, and by the south, I'm really talking about no further south than probably Asyut. We're not going to go as far south as Aswan. We're going to be looking at really only conducting operations with a view of destroying forces and then falling back, not holding ground. But whenever we do that, or when we have done that, we've then looked at kind of uprisings in the north. We're going to construct a couple of brigade-sized forces, and we've got a 1 brigade which we broke off from our deployment at Benghazi, which has been doing kind of good work in securing the kind of the interior of Egypt's areas with which you've only got tracks, no development really, where you can't get supplies, and this cavalry brigade's been doing good work. The other downside, possibly related to Abdelaziz having his kind of administration zeroed out, is that we're looking at more revolts again. It's feeling like the 50s again, early 50s, especially in kind of Libya. We've moved forces to deal with, for example, a revolt in Sirte, which destroyed our colonial fort. I don't think, for whatever reason, we can replace that colonial fort either. No, we can't, and I don't know why. And also in Mesopotamia, sort of modern-day Iraq, this is the second revolt in Najaf that we've seen in the last 12 months. That we've got localized forces that are well placed to deal with it. It's not kind of anything that's really a real serious issue. It's not destroying any infrastructure or anything like that. But at some point, there's the question of, is it like the spread? There is no kind of intrinsic revolt risk to these regions now. The empire, beyond the problems we face, we've kind of built the empire up to a point that, where the kind of institutions can kind of weather storms. The institutions can weather storms. There's very little intrinsic revolt risk in either Anatolia. There's a little bit in Batumi. And that's pretty much it. And the revolt risk in Europe even is, for the most part, dealt with. We've got it fairly well suppressed in Albania, for the most part, or at least Sarajevo. And it's limited to kind of northern Greece and the most northern part of Bulgaria and kind of southern Serbia. Whether that's going to spread, I don't know. We've got military police deployed into the towns, into Janina and Larissa, northern Greece. It's not doing much in terms of suppressing revolt risk, truth be told. It's sort of, but it's one of those things where it's probably going to be worse if they're not there, sort of thing, So we're going to keep forces there for the time being. I think with regard to Greece and Romania, we might be looking at constructing forces especially designed for long-term occupation. Probably brigade-sized forces aren't going to cut it. This is not like a colonial province in East Africa or the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula. It's more populous. It's much more kind of inflected by kind of European notions of ethnic conflict. So it's going to, it's going to have a much more mass appeal. The insurgencies are much more likely to be be more serious, more likely to get real kind of, insurgents are much more likely to kind of develop a weight and momentum to them. To that end, we're probably going to be looking at division-sized forces. The core-sized forces that we have, the large field commands, is overkill. These forces are never going to struggle to deal with an insurgency, but we don't want to have 100,000 men pinned down in Athens or the Peloponnese. Whatever benefits we get from controlling these regions is infinitely offset by having these kind of forces long-term held in southern Greece. So we're probably looking at division-sized forces, maybe 1 or 2 divisions, supplemented by like a brigade of cavalry to provide a bit of mobility and reconnaissance, that sort of thing. So that's probably going to be on the cards, I think. If we're going to be looking at long-term military occupations in Greece and Romania, I think that's going to be what we're looking at, really. And to just sit back, keep reading the reports, and at some point, who knows, it might be the case that we get, an offer from them. An offer that we can live with. It's a real shame because it means that we can't exploit these coal sites in Drabetta, which is the main reason we wanted. The main reason we kind of, I mean, well, not the only reason. It's the main. It's one of the main reasons we're looking at, really, is that we do have a shortage of coal. I mean, economically, this is another thing as well. Gradually, we're beginning to see a kind of climb in the value of our imports. So we're importing much more than we ever have. I mean, it was teeter-tottering around the 1,000 mark, and that's because we're now importing a lot of coal, a lot of timber, and a lot of chemicals. And these are consistent imports that happen every single term. And it makes us, you know, like, it makes us much more vulnerable to market volatility as well. Like, if there's a sudden shortage of chemicals on the market, this has a big impact on our agricultural production, which then impacts, for example, the agriculture that we have available for export, which begins to hurt our turnover. So, yeah, we're economically a bit more vulnerable. We do have a much bigger economy, but it is an economy that's much more based on trade than it was. You know, we would still have an economy that would generate profit, like, even if we didn't export anything. But it wouldn't be a lot of profit, especially with the imports required just to kind of see our economy operate fortnight upon fortnight. So, yeah. The economy's okay, the economy's ticking over, but we're kind of mindful of the fact that we're now reliant on the availability of, you know, an increasing range of kind of commodities. We also import a huge amount of gold from the world market, mostly from Latin America, which we convert, and that conversion is required for a huge amount of ongoing expenses, which have broadened in the last year alone. They've broadened to include other kind of branches, so including now balloons, topical right now. But balloons are something that gives us a unit in our force pull, which could be handy. I think. I mean, these aren't the balloons that are featuring in the news just now. These are the sort of low-level observation balloons, I believe, that are used for kind of artillery spotting and communications. So they basically give us a bigger command point. It means that our officers have more command points available to them, so they can have slightly larger armies. The other thing that does that are signaling detachments. We've just built a whole lot of signaling regiments in Ankara. These are going to be kind of divvied out to the various commands then, based on the empire. These have just been completed. But yeah, these do a similar kind of thing. They allow for more command points, basically, per stack. So it means that we can basically squeeze more forces, more independent artillery and stuff like that into our commands, which is good. The other thing that happened that's really interesting, that I've never seen before, and that is that I was checking reports, and one of the units was upgraded in the Reserve Corps of Czechs, and I thought, I wonder what that is. So I was looking through, I checked the name, and I think it was Klagenfurt. Yeah, it was this regiment. Now I looked at all the other regiments, and they're all 1870 to 1890, and they have a Czech, this kind of Czech roundel. And then one of the units upgraded, and it's still 1870 to 1890, but it doesn't have a distinctive Czech roundel, and it has a new kind of uniform. And I thought, I wonder if that's something, because I've always used Reserve Corps for a relatively brief period of time, and then I've kind of decommissioned them, you know. And I thought, I wonder if you hold them for long enough, whether they just gradually become naturalized. And this is what happens. They gradually upgrade over a long period of time. To that end, I'm going to keep this Czech Corps in place in Adrianople as a bit of an experiment. You know, there's nothing wrong with it being there anyway. It provides a good garrison, in addition to the Adrianople garrison. But yeah, I'm going to do that. I'm going to keep that in place, because my suspicion is, something I never realized, something I never noticed in the rules, is that over a period of time, these elements become naturalized. They become basically Ottoman elements, which is interesting. And that means they might be used over a long period of time in much the same way as any other regular Ottoman line sort of, infantry corps, which would be interesting if that is the case. So I'll keep an eye on that. That means that in future, if that does happen, say between now and 1880, a certain number of kind of prisoners, it might be worth holding them long term. And yeah, keeping these kind of volunteer forces as a kind of permanent feature of the campaign. Not all of them. If we end up getting a lot, it is worth decommissioning them. The other thing that's happened is we've had access about a month ago to the American system of shipbuilding. We didn't have to research it. Some of these Academy of Science things just crop up. We know that it may be the case that they will appear as something that's researchable, but sometimes we don't even have to research it. Just osmosis style, if our neighbouring factions have access to this technology, then we can suddenly spontaneously have access to them. This does two things. One, I've not done it yet because I've been building up the manufactured goods. It allows us to upgrade our shipbuilding plant. The first one that we're going to upgrade is the shipbuilding plant. The first one that we built manually in Constantinople in the 1850s. We're now going to upgrade that. It costs quite a bit, especially in terms of manufactured goods, to allow us to build kind of industrial style ships. The other thing it does is, at a stroke, access to this technology renders all timber-built ships obsolete. They are now a thing of the past, and in their place we have the first early ironclad designs. So we get ironclad corvettes. There's no picture because there's an annoying bug in the game. There were pictures earlier on. Let's see if I can do some things to try and make make them visible. Yeah, they look slightly different. Why is it like this? So we can see the cavalry unit. No, it probably won't work. What I'll do is really quickly do this, resume game. Now we can see the kind of river transports. Let's see if we can see the actual small ironclads that we built. We can see them. Let's try again. Hey, there we go. Yeah, they look decidedly different. Much longer. So these are still timber ships. They still have auxiliary sails, but as the name suggests, cladding. The timber is being cladded over with iron. These are the first ironclad designs. They're 1860 to 1875. In addition to these, so these are basically the kind of timber ships that we're building, but they are longer, slightly larger. They still have the same number of guns for the most part, but yeah, they're just much heavier, much harder to sink. There's even ironclad war battleships, but I don't think these are multi-deckers. You can see they're much lower. They're much lower, but much longer. So they're not as high off the ground. They don't have as high a freeboard. In addition to those, we are researching dedicated ironclad corvette designs, ironclad frigate designs. So my suspicion is that this will lead to the next kind of level. So ironclads, obviously, they're not all equal. They probably existed in kind of gradients of quality, and what we've just had access to are the most rudimentary designs. We'll soon, within the next few years, have access to slightly outdated designs. To that end, I'm going to hold off till 73, 74, before we begin a massive naval construction program, which should hold us in good stead for about 10 to 20 years. I'm thinking to the mid-1880s, early 1890s. We're going to build a lot of ironclad ships, and then we'll move on to steel shipbuilding. The heaviest ships we want to mostly construct in steel because they have a bit more longevity to them. And of course, ironclads are a little bit of a transitional. That said, there were still iron ships in the first decade of the 20th century. So the Ottomans had, I think, some of the biggest ironclad ships. In fact, the biggest ironclad ship, I think, was an Ottoman ship. It was kind of, with Abdul Hamid, he bottled, the navy was huge, the Ottoman navy was huge under Abdul Aziz, but Abdul Hamid didn't really trust the admiralty. He bottled the navy up in Constantinople and deprived it of funds. And so when the kind of first war broke out with, I think it was with Greece in the 1890s, or maybe the sort of 1902, something like that, when the Ottomans lost Crete, they quickly realized that virtually all of the ships that they had just weren't even seaworthy. Like, they weren't seaworthy. A lot of the guns had been sold off, I guess, by corrupt admirals and stuff like that. So they had on paper the third largest navy in the world. But this navy could not even deal with this tiny kind of minor power in southern Greece, because of corruption and because the kind of government just didn't trust the admiralty. So we want to make sure that doesn't happen as best we can in the game. But we are going to, we're on the cusp of a big naval construction program and upgrading the port in Constantinople is the beginning of that. That's pretty much it in terms of reports. Nothing else has happened really. I think, as I said, the Franco-Prussian War is kind of happening. I don't know if this is a scripted event. I don't know if this is going to pertain to German unification. We're a bit late in the day. We're getting late in the day for German unification. I think if it happens, it will happen in the next 12 months or so. We'll see what happens. This has pretty much been what the map has looked like for the last few months. It suggests that the Prussian offensive has stalled. They haven't done as well as they did in real life. We'll see what happens. We'll see what unfolds. But this is a war against the French Republic, not against the Second Empire. So we'll see what happens there. That's pretty much it. No other significant events to report. Next video I'll try and get up in the next few days. This video a bit shorter than the last one. The last one was a bit of a bumper episode. But yeah, thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.